and if you have to write a thesis, a master's thesis, or even a doctoral dissertation, these principles would apply just on a much larger scale. Sometimes professors call this a term paper instead of a research paper. It's the same thing, okay? So most of the papers, I would say, that you write in college are going to fall into this category that we're going to talk about today. I also, too, want to clarify the word planning. We're actually going to go a little bit further than that today, and we're going to talk about how to incorporate sources into your paper. And so we're going to really almost take it all the way through the drafting step. The only thing we're not going to talk about today is revising and editing your paper. So maybe if you're interested, we could do another workshop on that down the road. So let's begin. Here's my outline for what we're going to cover today. We are going to look at the big picture and actually the planning of the planning. Then we're going to look at topic selection. We're going to talk about how to write a good thesis statement. We're going to talk about outlining, and we're going to talk about how to choose and evaluate sources, and finally a little bit about how to integrate those sources into your paper. So let's begin with the first step. A lot of people skip this planning step because it does not seem like real work to them. But this step is really crucial, especially the longer the assignments that you're writing. So those big end of semester research papers, I strongly recommend that you take some time to plan. So the first thing you want to do is read those instructions that your professor has given you in the syllabus. Read them at the beginning of the semester so that you know what you're getting into, and read them carefully so that you understand. And if you have questions, ask your professor. Professors don't mind when you ask questions about things that are not clear to you in the syllabus. As long as you've done that prior research, they're happy to answer those questions for you. And then I strongly recommend that you create your own deadlines. If the professor hasn't already given you deadlines, and some of them do, some of your professors actually, really recognize that writing is a process, and they might say, okay, you get 10 points for having a thesis statement, and then later you get 50 points for a rough draft, something like that. But sometimes in an 8-week course, it's hard to incorporate those kinds of things. So I would recommend that you create your own deadlines. When are you going to have your outline done? When are you going to have your notes taken? When are you going to have your first page written? Because that's crucial. And then I would recommend to write a first draft and then write another draft later, and build in time to receive feedback from the Online Writing Center. I know a lot of people like the idea of the Online Writing Center, but they don't finish their work in time to actually take advantage of that service. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the Online Writing Center at the end here, but build in time to use that resource. So once you've made a plan, the next thing that you want to do is choose a topic. And by the way, I'm going in a certain order here, but you don't necessarily need to follow the order of the steps that I'm presenting today. Some people like to write an outline before they write a thesis statement, etc. So this is not a hard and fast process. Choosing a topic. The first important thing here, and I'm going to repeat this several times during this presentation because it's so important, you want to make sure that you follow the assignment instructions. I actually got in trouble in my junior year of college because I had written a paper that I thought was really good, and I think it was a pretty good paper, but I didn't follow the assignment guidelines about the topic. I was writing about something the professor had told us not to write about. She actually ended up calling me into her office and saying, I'm going to give you a D on this paper unless you revise it, and I was all horrified and everything. She did graciously let me revise it, and I ended up getting a B on the paper. But it's important, no matter how good your paper is, to follow those assignment instructions. Sometimes your professors will give you a lot of guidance about a topic. Sometimes they'll give you a lot of freedom. So another thing to think about is start with what interests you, and then do a little bit of preliminary research. The research stage, and we'll talk about this later, you're looking for sources to incorporate in your paper, yes, but even before that, you want to look for sources that are going to help you to understand the topic a little bit better. And so do a little bit of preliminary research. Here are some places where you can get topic ideas if your professor has not given you a topic. Your course reading. There might be something in the textbook that you find that the professor does not really hit on very much, and so you want to learn more about that topic. Your lectures, your videos that you watch in your class. Classmates' comments. I actually got my master's thesis topic from a comment. It was kind of just a throwaway comment that a student had made when she was making a presentation in one of my classes. And I thought, I bet that particular thing in that book is a lot more important than she actually thinks it is. So that's what gave me the idea for my master's thesis. Could be things that interest you outside of class. It could be a movie that you watched. It could be something that you read for fun on your own. It could be something in your ministry or your job. A lot of people get really great paper ideas from things that they're dealing with at work or in their career. So keep an open mind. Just about anything can turn into a good paper topic. But we need to make sure that we turn it into a good paper topic by making it narrow. And I think this is the biggest mistake that people pick with topics. They pick extremely broad topics And what happens here is two things. First of all, information overload. There's way too much data, too many sources, and the student doesn't know what to do. It doesn't have time to wade through all those sources. So you end up maybe picking the ones that aren't the best or just feeling really overwhelmed. Another thing that broad topics tend to lead to is really shallow papers. Kind of like if you read an encyclopedia article, you know that it's going to give you, like say you look up an encyclopedia article on elephants or something like that. It's going to give you a ton of information on elephants, but it's going to be really surface level. It's not going to be the kind of information that like a scientist or biologist who studies elephants would know about. So it's good information, but it's just not deep, and it's not college level. So that's the problem with a broad topic. Take your initial idea, whatever pops into your mind first, and keep pushing it to make it as narrow as you possibly can. I'm giving you an example here on the PowerPoint. We used to kind of joke in the Graduate Writing Center that the worst seminary paper topic or title would be Jesus, because it's such a broad topic. I mean, how can you say everything that there is to be said about Jesus? So I've given you an example here. So if you start, you know you want to write about Jesus, okay, so then we narrow it down to his earthly life, those 33 years when he lived on earth. And then we're going to narrow that down to his childhood. But there's still a lot you could say about Jesus' childhood. So let's narrow that down to that temple incident there when he was 12 years old and he went and his parents thought he was with them and he wasn't, so they ran back to Jerusalem and tried to find him and he was in the temple. But even that would still be, I think, kind of a broad paper. So I've narrowed it down this far to, you know, in that story Jesus says, I must be about my Father's business. I think it would be a really good school of religion or seminary paper to write about, okay, what did Jesus mean when he said, I must be about my Father's business? And so we've taken this extremely broad topic and we've narrowed it down to something manageable. All right, so once you have a topic, you actually want to figure out what you're going to argue or claim about that topic, and that's going to be your thesis statement. So let's talk about the thesis statement. This is your paper's main argument and each main point presented in brief. It's one sentence typically, and we'll talk about the specifics of that in a minute here. Now in some fields, this might have a different title. I know we usually use the term thesis statement in English, and maybe in some of your other classes you hear it too, but sometimes your professors might just say, make sure your paper has a main claim or something like that. If you're in the social sciences and you're asked to do like an empirical study, it might be called a hypothesis. Technically, a hypothesis is a little bit different from a thesis, and I'm not going to go into that today, but basically whatever term your professor uses for it, you need to make sure you have a sentence that your readers can look at and say, okay, this is what this paper is about. Not just what it's about, but this is what the author thinks about this topic. The thesis usually belongs near the beginning of the paper. In some situations, certain genres of writing, there might be exceptions to this, but usually in a college level academic paper, you're going to put your thesis statement near the beginning of the paper, but it's not the first sentence of the paper, unless you're writing something like really, really brief, like maybe a business report. But typically, your thesis statement needs to be at the end of your introduction. Could be at the end of your first paragraph, could be later if your introduction is longer than one paragraph. You need to take some time to draw your readers into the topic, to let them know why this is an important topic, and then you get to your thesis statement. So let's look at a couple of other qualities of a good thesis statement. It's usually a single sentence. Whenever my English 102 students have a thesis statement that's maybe 2 sentences, I tell them, can you tighten this up? Can you make this into 1 sentence? It's just easier for your readers to find if it's 1 sentence. But it's usually a long sentence because it's got to do a lot of work. And I'll show you an example of a good thesis statement that is long in a couple minutes here. This is really important. Your thesis statement needs to be arguable. It needs to be something that some people might disagree with. It cannot just be a statement of fact. So for example, if I wanted to write a research paper about Charles Dickens, it would not be a good thesis statement to say Charles Dickens was born in 1812, because that's a historical fact. You can look it up. Nobody's really going to argue against it. It's an agreed upon fact. So if it's not a fact, that means it's an opinion. I think we need to talk about that word opinion, because sometimes people get a little nervous about the word opinion when it comes to academic writing, and they think, well, I'm not supposed to share my opinion. Actually, yes, when you write a thesis statement, you are stating your opinion, but 2 important qualifications about that. One, it's your opinion backed up with reasons. So it's not just how you feel. You've done the research, you've come to a certain conclusion, and it's a well-reasoned conclusion. The second thing, too, I think sometimes when people think about stating their opinion, they think about using the word I and saying things like I feel and I believe. And you know, you're right when you think, you know, you're not supposed to use I in a paper. Typically, you're not supposed to use I in a college level paper. But you don't need to. In your thesis statement, you don't need to say I believe, you know, Charles Dickens was the greatest novelist of the 19th century. If you've done the research and you can actually prove that, you can just say Charles Dickens was the greatest novelist of the 19th century. I don't know if that's a good thesis statement, but you see what I mean. It gives you, it's not, you sound much more confident when you just come out and say it instead of kind of qualifying it by I feel or I believe. Okay, and then your thesis statement should also provide your readers with a roadmap for the rest of the paper. Once I've read your thesis statement, I should know where the rest of the paper is going, pretty much. Also, by the way, your main points, and most people have 2 to 4, sometimes maybe 5 main points. I would not do more than that in a paper. Your main points should appear in the thesis statement in the same order that they're going to appear in the rest of the paper, just, again, to help your readers navigate your paper. So let's look at a poor thesis statement. This thesis statement says, in this paper, I'm going to show why I support candidate A over candidate B. Now, there are a couple things that are wrong here. I've showed this to students before, and they pointed out there's a contraction in here, and it's not good to use contractions in academic writing, and that's true. But that's more of a kind of a surface grammar formality issue. So let's look at what's really wrong with this as a thesis statement. First of all, the sentence gives no indication of the main points of the paper or the author's reasons for his or her position. So you see it's a very short sentence. That's too short to be a thesis statement. We don't have any reasons why this person supports candidate A over candidate B, and those need to be in there. Secondly, why this author supports the candidate is really not a topic for an academic paper. It's more like a personal kind of editorial essay. Your readers don't really care why you support this candidate or why you're going to vote for this candidate. They want to know why they should vote for the candidate and why, in general, this candidate is better than the other. And then third, and I put a little asterisk by this one because this is wrong for some disciplines but not for others. This author has used a tactic known as announcing, and that's when you say things like, I am going to show, or this paper will prove, or the researchers found, or it was found, or something like that. That's actually okay in some disciplines like the social sciences. You might see a statement like that in a psychology or counseling paper, but it's usually frowned upon in the humanities, which include English, history, theology. So just if you're not sure whether it's okay to do announcing in your classes, I would say maybe just don't do it if in doubt, but talk to your professors because it's important to learn about what's acceptable in your field or not. So those are some things that are wrong with this thesis statement. I think the first one is probably the biggest problem, but the others are important too. So let's look at a thesis statement that's on the same topic, but does a much better job. So I'll just read it out loud for you first. Because of his well-informed strategies for eradicating organized crime, his reformist stance on government-level corruption, and his extensive experience in the legal profession, Harvey Dent is the stronger of the 2 candidates for district attorney. And I've color-coded it here so that you can see we now have 3 main points. Now, like I said, you don't have to have 3 main points in your paper, but that's a good average number of main points to have. So we have 3 of them, and then we have that main claim. That last part there, the part that's in bold, is the actual argument that the person is making. You notice here that the main points are before the central claim or argument. You could flip it and you could say, you know, Harvey Dent is the stronger of the 2 candidates for district attorney because, and then do it that way. So we now have clear reasons for the position. Now the focus has shifted from the author's personal views to the strengths of the candidate himself. So we no longer have, I'm going to vote for this guy, because now we have, he is the stronger of the 2 candidates. And notice too that this one's also just a lot more specific. The name is mentioned, it tells you what he's running for. You want to be as specific as possible in a thesis statement. And then also the author's more subtle presence, or the fact that, you know, the author's no longer saying, I'm going to vote for this guy. That's also solved the problem of announcing, so we no longer have that problem either. So this is, oh, and notice too, this is a pretty long thesis statement. It wouldn't look quite that long, I think, in a Word document. It looks very long here because it's on a PowerPoint, but still, it is a lengthy sentence, because if you're going to have a good, thorough thesis statement that does all the work it needs to do, it's going to be a pretty long sentence. All right, now that we've talked about thesis statements, the natural next step is to write an outline. Although, as I said, some people like to do it in reverse order, and I think maybe as we talk here, it'll be clear to you why some people like to do it in reverse order. Let me give you a couple of misconceptions that a lot of people have about outlining, because I know a lot of students, a lot of my students, when I tell them they have to have an outline, they kind of roll their eyes and they say, I hate outlining. And I think part of that is because they have some wrong ideas about outlining. So the first misconception here is a lot of people think the outlines have to have Roman numerals. They have to have, you know, big Roman numeral 1 and capital A and then Arabic numeral 1 and all those things that you have to remember in a certain kind of order. That's really not true. Now, some people like to write that type of outline. Fine. If you do, great. If you don't like that type, or if you never learned how to write it, it's okay. You get to choose the format of your outline. If you want to use bullet points and create a hierarchy with your bullet points, that's fine. If you want to do, you know, a handwritten outline that's just kind of, you know, maybe wouldn't make sense to somebody else, but it makes sense to you, that's fine too. Whatever is going to work for you at this point. Now, if you have to turn in an outline, if your professor actually requires to see your outline, then you want to clean it up and you want to make it look a little bit more formal. But right now, we're just talking about the outline that's going to guide you through your paper, and that one can look however you want it to look. Here's another misconception about outlines, that it needs to be completed before you begin writing and can never change. Now, there's two aspects to this. First, that it needs to be completed before you begin writing. Some people hate writing outlines before they begin their paper because they say, I don't really know what I'm going to say until I've already said it. If you're one of those people and you want to write an outline after you write your paper, that's fine. However, I would say it does help to have something down on paper before you start actually trying to write the introduction and all this kind of thing. I think it really helps to have some kind of document that you can go back to and see, okay, this is what I'm trying to say. But don't force it. If you can't write an outline before you write your paper, don't try to force it. The other thing too is the misconception is that it can never change. That's not true. It's a fluid document. If you find that you're not really proving one of the points that you thought you were going to prove in your research, you might need to change your outline. You might find that one of your points is not as important as you originally thought it was going to be, and you decide to delete that point or maybe turn it into a sub-point. You can do that. Now, you should know the reasons why you're changing your outline if you do decide to change it, but it's okay to change it. All right, here's a couple, I call these secrets because they're just things that, like little tips that can help you to work smarter, not harder, as they say. If you have already written your thesis statement, you've already got your main outline points. Those, like I said, about 2 to 5 main points, they're already there in your thesis statement. This also works the other way around. If you write your outline first, all you have to do is basically condense it, and now you've got a thesis statement. Another thing, I've seen students do this before, if you write a really, really thorough outline that's written in complete sentences, you've pretty much written your paper. It's got a lot of subpoints and that sort of thing. I've seen students in my introductory English classes that have written like 4 to 5 page outlines. And those people really didn't have to do a whole lot of work once they had written their outline. All they needed to do was go back in and include transitions and an introduction and conclusion, and maybe incorporate their sources, although a lot of times those people already put all their quotes and their paraphrases in their outline. So if you're one of those people, you like to write a really thorough outline, good for you, because you're getting a lot of the work done kind of ahead of time for yourself. And then another little trick here is if you are writing an APA paper and it's a longer paper, you're encouraged to have headings in your paper. That's an APA thing. If you've written a good outline that has good points and subpoints, you can actually turn those points into your headings for your APA paper and your subheadings. This works too if you're writing a longer paper in Turabian. A lot of times you're required to have a table of contents, or if you're writing a thesis or dissertation in any field, you need to have a table of contents. And so if you've written a good outline, you can typically maybe do a little bit of tweaking and turn that outline into your table of contents. So it's really useful to have an outline for a lot of reasons. So let me just give you a couple more reasons that apply to everybody. Your outline is really your paper's keystone. It's that thing that's holding your paper together, or it should be. So whatever it ends up looking like, if you write it on the back of a 3x5 card, if you make it a very formal Word document, whatever it is, keep it in a place where you're going to see it constantly while you're writing your paper. This is going to help with a couple things. It'll help to keep you motivated. If you can see the ending of the paper written out, that last point, it's going to help you want to keep moving forward, hopefully. It'll prevent you from going off topic. If you find yourself writing about something, or maybe writing a really long paragraph and you think, wait a minute, should I be talking about all this? You can go back to your outline and check it and see, does this really match up with what I'm saying, match up with my outline? If not, you probably shouldn't be going there. And then it'll also help you move forward when you get stuck. If you come to the end of a subtopic and you think, okay, I've run out of things to say about this, where do I go next? If you've got that outline written, you can see clearly where you're supposed to go next. So kind of like your thesis statement, it's a map for your paper. And really, I think that outlines are meant to help the writer more than the reader. So make sure it's something that's really going to help you. All right, let us talk now about sources. I'm going to try here not to overlap with things that you might have already heard in a library workshop. I'm not going to go really in depth about where to find sources because that's the library's field, but I'm going to talk a little bit about how to use your sources well. Now, one thing I should say here is that all throughout the research process, all throughout the process of planning and writing a paper, you should be doing research. There's not really I like to say there's not a time when you start or stop doing research. It's just you should be really immersing yourself in the topic that you're writing about. You should be reading constantly. I think the biggest mistake that people make with research papers is that they try to write the paper first and then go back in and insert the sources. And that causes all kinds of problems. For one thing, a lot of times those sources that they find, those quotes, are really not going to be relevant. They might not understand the quotes, and I know the professor can certainly tell that they've just been sort of stuck in there to meet the required quota of quotes or paraphrases. So there's that. But also people get stuck. If you sit down and you try to, maybe this has happened to you before, if you try to start, drafting your paper and you haven't done any reading yet, you're not going to know what to say. And so really you should be reading and doing research all the way through this process. Now, I want to talk about two types of sources here. There's a lot of different ways to categorize sources, but I'm going to look at just these two. Some sources give you basic information and help you narrow your topic. So back, like we talked about with the topic selection, if you have an initial topic idea and you want to just kind of inform yourself a little bit more about that topic before you feel confident even doing in-depth research about it, you can do that. And this is where encyclopedias can be helpful. And I'm talking about Wikipedia here. Wikipedia actually could be helpful at this step. I know a lot of people say, no, Wikipedia is evil. It's not evil. It's just not a source that you probably want to cite in your finished paper. But it can be really good for helping you just get some background information about a topic, and that's true for any encyclopedia. Then the other type of source, and these are the more specific, more in-depth sources, the very narrow topic focus. I put scholarly and peer-reviewed in quotes here because you'll see that those are words that your professors use a lot. They'll say, you need to have 5 peer-reviewed sources in your paper, and you need to have 5 scholarly sources. And by the way, let me just pause for a second. Peer-reviewed means that usually two or more people from the field that the author works in have read whatever it is, the article or the book, and they've read it and said, okay, this makes sense, I approve it, it fits in with the current thinking in our field. That's what peer review means. So that author's peers have reviewed the work and approved of it. So your professors will sometimes use that term. So these kinds of sources, they're the ones that might be a little bit more difficult to read, but they're the ones that are really going to make your argument stronger. And these are the ones that should be appearing in your paper in the form of quotes and paraphrases. I want to make an important clarification here because I've just talked about 2 different types of sources. If this is just true across the board, if you use words or ideas from a source directly in your paper, you paraphrased, you quoted, you must cite that source. And if you're not sure if you really directly used it, if in doubt, cite it. Now, sometimes, occasionally, this happens. If you use a source early on in your research process to help inform you about a topic, maybe help you narrow your topic down, but you ended up not really using the ideas of that source in your paper, check with your professor as to whether you should cite it. There's really 2 philosophies about citing. You can do a works cited or you can do a works consulted, and I'm not going to go into what all that means, but some professors want you to list every source that you even looked at during the process. Others will say only list the ones that appear in your paper. So just talk to them about that. That's an important conversation to have. But just remember, if in doubt, cite. All right, so let's talk about some ideas for where to look for sources. Talk to your professor. Now, do not expect your professors to do your research for you. That is not their job. But sometimes if you're stuck, they can help you point you in the right direction. This is especially important if you are writing a thesis or a dissertation. You want to talk to a trusted professor about like what is, the main source that I should be citing on this topic, and then if I don't cite it, it's going to mean a big gap or hole in my research. So they can give you some ideas. Some professors actually put a list of suggested sources in the syllabus. So take a look at your syllabus and see if you have something like that. Use the sources that your other sources cite. This is one place where Wikipedia is actually really helpful because you don't want to cite Wikipedia in your academic paper, but Wikipedia, at least the really good articles, has endnotes. So you can see where the author of the article got the information from. And so a lot of times people have found really good journal articles and books by looking at the endnotes on a Wikipedia article. So take a look at that. It could give you some really good sources. If you are using a particular book or journal article and it has a list of references or bibliography at the end, maybe use some of those sources that that person cited, called cross-referencing, and it's a really smart thing to do. Use the Jerry Falwell Library's resources. As I said, I'm not going to take the time to go into these in depth, but there are all kinds of resources for you as an online student. You can borrow journal articles through interlibrary loan. There's all kinds of instant access things in the databases. There are ebooks. You can even get a physical copy of a book through interlibrary loan if you pay for the shipping. All kinds of things that you can do. So please take advantage of those. The library's got some good tutorials too for helping you figure that out. Browse a local library or bookstore. I know sometimes it just is nice to actually be looking at some physical books that you can pick up, and sometimes you run into sources that you might not have even thought about just by looking at the books that are on the shelf next to the book that you were looking for. So take some time to do that. And then talk to others interested in the topic. If you're writing about a career that you're interested in and you know somebody that works in that career, talk to people in that career and say, okay, what are some of the best journals in this field? What are some books that are indispensable reading? And talk to them. So this should give you a lot of different ideas of where to look for sources. Evaluating sources. This is really, really important, especially because we have the internet, and people can post just about anything they want to on the internet. And so it's really even more important today than it ever was before to know how to tell if a source is good or not. So I'm going to repeat this point I've made several times. Follow the assignment instructions. Your professors might give you some restrictions about what you can cite and not cite. They might say don't use any sources older than 10 years old. They might say only use peer-reviewed sources, things like that. So pay attention to that. Learn what an appropriate source looks like in your field. This can vary widely. For example, I keep using like social sciences, like psychology and counseling as an example. I know that in those fields, you don't want to be citing anything that's older really than a lot of times 10 years or even shorter than that. Whereas in my field, which is literature, I can cite a much older source, and I can cite Shakespeare, and nobody cares that Shakespeare's 500 years old because he's not going to go out and date. So learn what an appropriate source looks like in your field. Some fields are a lot more receptive and okay with citing websites than others. And the way that you learn this, talk to your professors, and also read journal articles in your field and see what kinds of sources they cite. Here are a couple things to be especially careful with. I already mentioned why you should be careful with encyclopedias. They're just way too broad and shallow. Be careful with websites because, websites are not peer-reviewed. They haven't gone through any kind of review process. Anybody can create a blog these days with WordPress. So just be really careful. If it's a .com, they're probably trying to sell you something, so you should keep that in mind. If it's a .edu, it could be a university website. It could be really good, or it could be a kindergarten class's website. So just pay attention to that. .govs are usually pretty good and objective because they have, usually just government statistics on them. .orgs, it depends on the organization. So just be aware. Know how to look for if, for example, if the website has a lot of errors in it, factual errors, misspellings, it may not be reliable. So just be aware of those kinds of things. And I'll come back to another reason for that in a second here. Be careful with older sources. Even I mentioned, you know, it's okay in literary studies to use older sources, but even then, I want to be careful if I'm using a source that's maybe 50 years old. It's not that the facts are changing, you know, the research is not going out of date, but sometimes just the trends in the field will change over time, and so I might want to just think twice before I use a source that was, you know, 50 or 100 years old. Same thing I would say like in not psychology, but theology. Then be careful too with popular works. These are books that, you know, they usually have the bright front covers and they might be bestsellers. Same thing with magazines. Popular magazines would be ones like, you know, that have the glossy pages and pictures in them, things like National Geographic and Time and Newsweek and that sort of thing. The information in these works is usually quite good, but they don't typically cite their sources, which means, again, that they're not written for a college-level academic audience. And so be careful with popular works. In some cases, they might be fine to cite, and it really depends on the type of paper that you're writing and your goals with your paper. That's another thing. If you're not sure, talk to your professors about it. But usually, if the source is not itself citing sources, you know, if it doesn't have endnotes or parenthetical citations, it may not be a good source for you to cite. So think carefully about that. And then find out what you can about the author. A lot of books, you know, have an about the author section. Sometimes, you know, magazines and journals will have a little blurb about the author as well. You might need to do a little bit of research on the internet to find out about the author. Is this person qualified to be writing on this topic? If you run into a source that does not have an author, really think twice about citing that source. Sources that don't have authors, you know, is there a reason why they're trying to be anonymous? It could have been group authored, but you know, it just, you really can't know whether it's a reliable source or not if you don't know who wrote it. And then this kind of leads into the next point here. Be aware of hidden assumptions and biases. Notice I didn't say here don't use biased sources, because every source is biased to an extent. We all have biases that we you know, that shape, it's really kind of like our worldview. It's the way that we think and the way that we kind of interpret the world. So it's okay to have biases, but two things about this. One, hidden biases. Sometimes people will come out and say, okay, I'm writing this from a Christian perspective, or maybe I'm writing this from a Marxist perspective. And so then you know what their bias is. But other times they won't tell you, and you have to kind of read along and figure it out yourself. So just be aware of those. There's nothing wrong with citing a book that comes from, you know, a Christian worldview or Marxist worldview or whatever. Just make sure you know the implications of that bias and that you can find it. Same thing with assumptions. If somebody, you know, is basing one of their main points on an assumption, make sure you can figure out what that assumption is, and if, you know, see if it's really a valid assumption or not. This really requires critical thinking when you evaluate a source. And if it doesn't look like it's reliable, or if it looks like it's just really, really too biased in one direction and doesn't even consider the opposite point of view, probably don't want to cite that in your paper. Okay, now let's talk about integrating the sources. How do you actually use them in your paper? This is one of the, like I said, one of the biggest mistakes that people make. They try to cite a source that they have not first read and understood. And believe me, I've seen some papers where I can tell the person just said, okay, here's a quote, it's got a keyword in it that I think is relevant to my paper, so I'm just going to stick it in here. They don't know the context of the quote, and they really don't understand what the author is trying to say. That completely defeats the purpose of a research paper. Research paper assumes that you've done the research first and you understand what these authors are trying to say. Really, you want to think of research as a conversation. The authors are speaking and interacting with each other, and you yourself as a scholar are joining that conversation. And so you want to make sure you understand what the other people are saying. So, on the other hand, though, don't overwhelm yourself. If a lot of your sources, let's say, are full books, you probably don't have time or need to read the entirety of the book. So make sure that you can find the chapters that are most relevant to your topic so that you have a manageable amount of research to do. And then as you read, take meaningful notes. You can do this however you want to. Some people like to still do handwritten note cards. Some people like to take notes in a Word document. Other people like to highlight and write notes in their margin, although that doesn't really give you a whole lot of room. But there are all different ways to do this. I said here meaningful notes because you don't want to take a note on everything. You want to, be sparing with the notes you take. Is this something that you're really going to be able to use in the paper? And do you really understand the note that you're taking? That's important too. You can, if there's a quote that really stands out to you and you're like, wow, I want to use this exact quote, fine, write that down. But most of the time when you're taking notes, you should be trying to put it in your own words because you don't want to have too many quotes in your paper, as we'll talk about in a couple minutes here. And then this is just a practical tip. Always make sure you write down that page number. I've had some problems recently in trying to write my doctoral dissertation where I took some notes and I really wanted to include that information in my paper. And I knew what book it was from, but I didn't know what page it was on, and I forgot to include that. And I use MLA. With MLA and also Turabian, it's really, really important to make sure you know what page it came from. And so I tore through the book and I tried to find it, and I couldn't. And I eventually had to give up on some of those quotes because I didn't write down the page number the first time. So make sure you do that. It's really, really important. Okay, 3 ways to integrate a source into your paper. The first is quotation. This is where, as you probably know, you're using the exact words from the source. If you need to make a couple of little changes for grammar, you can do that. There's different ways to show that in different documentation styles, but basically you're using the exact same words from the quote and you're enclosing them in quotation marks. The second way here is paraphrasing. In this case, the ideas or the concepts are from the source, but the words and the sentence structure are your own. So you're not just going through and changing the words, but you're actually significantly changing the way that it's written, but you're keeping the same idea. You're not changing or misrepresenting what the original author said. And then the third one here is summary. This one is similar to a paraphrase because you are putting it in your own words, but here you're only hitting the main points. A summary is shorter than the original text. So if you write a summary of a whole book, it might be a section of your paper. If you write a summary of like a chapter, it might be a paragraph. If you write a summary of a paragraph, it might be one sentence. So it's always going to be shorter than the original. Okay, how not to paraphrase. Unfortunately, this is how a lot of people paraphrase. This is not a good idea. They will choose a sentence that sounds good and think, okay, I want to put that in my paper. I'm going to try to paraphrase it. Then they will keep the book open on their desk and they'll keep looking back and forth from the book or the journal article to their paper, to their screen, and they'll try to look up a synonym for every word, and maybe they'll right-click on it in Microsoft Word and think like, okay, I don't want to use the word man, so I'm going to use the word male instead. And they'll go through with every word and they'll try to change it like that. This is not a good way to paraphrase. The first thing is that it takes forever. You can imagine if you have to go word by word through the sentence and look up a synonym for every word, it's going to take forever. Secondly, you're probably going to end up with awkward wording because in English, a lot of times we don't have 2 words that mean the exact same thing. Sometimes we do, but other times you're just going to end up using a synonym that really doesn't mean what you're trying to say. And then third, and maybe most importantly, if the sentence structure still remains the same as in the original, so if all you did was change the vocabulary but you didn't change the way the sentence is set up, that's still considered plagiarism, and you actually could get in trouble for that. So it's important to be really careful with that. So let's talk about a better way to paraphrase. First of all, choose a relatively short section of text and read it until you understand it. You may need to read it multiple times. You want to make sure that this is a concept that you really understand, you can grasp it. And then put the book or article away. I mean, put a bookmark in it, minimize the screen, whatever, but don't look at it while you're writing. And then think about how you would explain this concept to someone and write that down in your own words. Now then, of course, you'll want to go back and revise. You can check for accuracy. Go back and check the original. Make sure you've, spelled people's names right, and make sure you're really representing the author's idea accurately. And then also revise for academic language. Sometimes the first time you write that down, it might be, the way you would speak it if you were speaking, and a lot of us speak more informally than we write. So you might have to go back and, take out the contractions and make it sound a little bit more academic. But the important thing is that it sounds like your voice. It's the way that you understand that concept, and it's the way that you would explain it to somebody. That's the best way to paraphrase. In fact, that's really the only good way to paraphrase. So Let's move over to talk about quotations now. Quotations, actually, I think paraphrasing is the hardest way to incorporate sources into your paper, but it's usually the best way. Quoting is the easiest way to incorporate sources into your paper, but in certain fields you want to actually avoid quoting a lot, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But even though it's easier, still sometimes people get tripped up with how to integrate those quotations into the text. So ground rule here, a quote should not just hang out by itself. You shouldn't have a quote that's like a single sentence that doesn't have some sort of introduction in a paper. So there's two main ways to introduce quotation. There's really kind of three, but two of them are closely related. You might have heard the term signal tag before, like maybe in one of your English classes. A signal tag is just a few words or a phrase that introduces a quote. So a very common one is according to the author's name. So here we have according to Thomas, and then we have a comma, and then we have the quote. Another way to do that would be Thomas states or Thomas says, something like that. And you would have a comma. The one that I didn't put on the screen here that's kind of similar to this one, if you actually use a complete sentence to introduce a quote, a sentence that would make sense on its own, then you would actually use a colon there instead of a comma. You don't see that very often, but sometimes people do that. The other way, and I would encourage you to try this way, even though it's a little bit harder, it definitely makes your paper more interesting to read because it kind of varies things, is actually to integrate the quote into the grammar of the sentence. And so you can see here, he warns his readers not to go gentle into that good night. So the quote kind of just follows seamlessly from the rest of the sentence, and the only thing that marks it off of the quote is the quotation marks. And of course, if this were a real paper, there would be a citation there too. So we don't need any kind of comma or any punctuation mark there at all besides the quotation mark. So those are two ways to introduce your quotes into your papers. Here are just a couple of miscellaneous rules or tips for integrating sources. First of all, with summaries, remember the summary is going to be shorter than the original. Keep summaries short. I know I've seen a lot of book reviews where, you know, the first section of the book review is supposed to be a summary of the book, and the student just kept going on and on and on for maybe even 3 pages on the summary of the book, and it became the longest part of the book review, when really usually the summary should be the shortest part of the book review. So try to make it short in the first place. If you find that you've written a really long summary, go back and kind of take a second look at it and delete the things that don't need to be in there. And by the way, I should say this too, if you're writing an English paper or a paper on literature, it's generally understood that you don't need to summarize the plot. You're assuming in that field that the reader has already read the short story or the poem or the novel or whatever it is, so you actually don't need to summarize the plot at all. Don't quote too much. Most of the paper should be in your own words. Notice that I was very vague here. I just said most because I hesitate to give you a percentage because it changes depending on the field that you're in and the paper that you're writing and really just the individual needs of that specific topic. But as a general rule, if you can say it in your own words, then do say it in your own words. Quotes should usually just be reserved for those times when the author has said it so brilliantly that you could not say it better yourself. Certain fields, quoting is more acceptable than others. For example, in literature, we might be talking about poetry, and I'm not going to try to paraphrase somebody's poem because poetry, you know, the individual words that are used are really important, and so I'm probably going to quote from poetry. Same thing if you're writing a biblical studies paper like maybe on the Psalms. I mean, the Psalms are poetry too, so you probably can quote there and probably should quote there. But if you're writing in a discipline like, say, business, where it's important to be really, really concise, or psychology, where, you know, the concepts are a lot more important than the individual words that the person is using to express them. In those cases, you want to try to paraphrase or summarize as much as you can and not quote very much. And your professors will usually tell you that. Sometimes they'll even give you a percentage of quotes that you can have. And then this is not the topic of this particular workshop. We've done workshops on this before, but whether you quote, paraphrase, or summarize, you need to make sure you include a proper citation according to the assigned style, MLA, APH, Arabian, CE, if you use that one. Make sure you know how to do that and do it properly. Okay, I am going to give you some time here for questions, but we've reached almost the end of what I have here prepared. I just wanted to let you know, though, that the Online Writing Center, which some of you are probably already familiar with, this is the website for the Online Writing Center. liberty.edu/online writing center. And it's got, for one thing, a lot of free resources that you can just look at on your own. There are web guides to the different citation styles. There are worksheets that you can download and work on grammar on your own. There are a few videos. There are links to other schools' websites, all kinds of good resources on there. The other thing, too, is that the Online Writing Center offers one-to-one tutoring. This is free, and it's for no matter what level you're at. If you're a really confident writer or if you feel like you're a terrible writer, they're going to meet you where you're at. And this takes two forms. You can do what they call an asynchronous appointment, where you just upload your paper and they're going to review it within 48 hours and send you back the comments. They're not going to change anything in your paper, but they're going to write comments in the margin of Microsoft Word and explain to you what needs to be improved in your paper. The other thing, if you prefer really talking to a real person, you can make a live appointment where you'll have a Skype call with a tutor, and they actually just incorporated screen sharing where you and the tutor can both be looking at the paper at the same time. It's very interactive. You can talk to each other and really work on strengthening your paper in real time. So I encourage you to take advantage of those services. And right now, I guess we'll just have time for Q&A. So please let us know if you have questions.
The first one was from Aaron, and he was wondering, is there any type of process you might have to help narrow down topic selection, to get it down to a good
Yeah, a couple things. I was going to mention this in the workshop and then I forgot. We want brainstorming and free writing can both be really good things. Free writing is just where you kind of just write what you already know about a topic. Don't worry about grammar, that kind of thing. And just, you know, after you've written it, go back through it and point out what are some of the main points that came up in that free write that you might be interested in writing about. You can also, I don't know if you've ever learned other brainstorming techniques like clustering, where you start with the topic in the middle of the paper and then you draw these branches coming out from it. That's a really good way, too, to narrow down a topic. But I would say the main thing is just to read about your topic, and hopefully something will come up in your reading that you find interesting. And then one other thing, too, is to talk to people about it. That's the way I've come up with some of my best topics, is just talking to other people. Okay. Sure.
Another question I had come through earlier was kind of a general one, but one of our attendees doesn't have a lot of experience with Roman numerals. So their professor was wanting to use that. Is there any other resources with the online learning? Even words that might?
Yeah, you know, I don't think we have anything with the Online Writing Center with Roman numerals. There may be something in Word. I'm not aware of that, though. That might be a question for IT, but I know that if you probably just Googled Roman numerals, you could find a good website that would just have them all listed out. And probably there are even websites that show you like a format that you could, like a template that you could plug in outline points to, I would imagine.
Another one we had from Derek was in a very scholarly sources peer review. Is that a correct for it to be considered scholarly?
Yeah, usually those words are used interchangeably. That's changing a little bit now because a lot of people are publishing on the internet, and a lot of times web published sources are not peer reviewed. So I think most of the time when professors use those terms, they're interchangeable, but peer review is a little bit more specific than scholarly. A source could be scholarly even if it's not peer reviewed.
I know I have seen something in here about we have one that said a professor told this class that they could use one multi-volume book as separate sources for each volume. Is there a way to use, how would they cite those as separate sources?
Yeah, there's a way to do that, but it's going to vary depending on the citation style that you're using, and I don't know them off the top of my head, so I would just say, all of the manuals are going to have a section for citing a multi-volume work.
And one normal question is just, is a thesis statement be included in the abstract?
Yeah, usually your thesis statement will appear somewhere in your abstract. It might be the last, actually with an abstract, it might be the first sentence, your abstract. It'll go somewhere in your abstract. Yeah, it should.
With citing podcasts, is there a specific way or place to locate? Aaron said he's been looking to try to find out how to do that.
Which documentation style is he using, do you know? Okay. I'm trying to think, because MLA is the one that I'm most familiar with, and I don't think the latest edition of MLA came out, I want to say, well, it might have been 2010, but it's been several years now, and I don't think there's anything in there about citing podcasts. Turabian had a more recent edition. There might be something in there. APA, it's a little bit older too. I would imagine maybe like in the next edition of all those manuals there will be podcasts, but I'm not aware of it now.
Another question I have is it bad form to cite two sources in a single sentence?
It would be confusing, I think. I don't see that happen very often. You'd have to make it really, really clear which information comes from which source. Now, okay, I said that, but I was imagining quotes when I answered that question. If you're just kind of summarizing, and I see this a lot actually in APA articles, if you're just, you're trying to say that like many different authors have written about this particular topic, sometimes you do see like a long string of citations. So I'm not sure if that's what they're asking. That would be okay if it's just kind of a general summary, but I wouldn't quote more than one source in one sentence.
I'm not really seeing any other ones that we haven't listed yet. I know, I'm not sure what they're asking for specifically, but when you had covered paraphrasing and plagiarism, they were kind of wanting a little more clarification on how that could potentially happen.
Okay, yeah, I mean, if your paraphrase is similar to the original, like I said, if the sentence structure is very similar, meaning that the sentence is the same length and all the punctuation's in the same places and all the grammar's kind of in the same places and all you did was change the words, that's considered a form of plagiarism. If, if your professor's reading the paper and they think, hey, I've read something that was really similar to this before, that's a sign that you probably plagiarized. So that's why I say just, practice paraphrasing, and a lot of professors are gracious, and if you tried and if you did cite, if you had the proper citation, you probably aren't going to get in big trouble. But it's just, like I said, it's just important to make sure you're saying it the way you would say it. It needs to sound like you. Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you very much. Thank you for participating. I think I said everything. Yeah, somebody asked about self-plagiarism. That is a real thing. Self-plagiarism happens when you use either the exact same paper or a very similar paper that you turned in for another class. If you ask for your professor's permission and it's a completely different course, they might allow it, but if you do it without getting permission, that's considered self-plagiarism and you could get in trouble.
Thank you again, everybody, for joining us this afternoon for our webinar. I know a lot of you have really enjoyed the presentation that Tess gave us. If you have questions about where to view the recording, it is just liberty.edu/webinars. And if you have any questions related to this, feel free to email instructionalmedia@liberty.edu, and I would be more than happy to direct you in the right area or help answer as many questions as you have. But thank you again for taking time out of your day to be with us, and I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon.